All right, Action Bias asks, please debate decentralization of monetary value, ultimate threat for insiders' power erosion.
I interpret this as a Bitcoin question. So
yeah,
I think one of the most interesting things happening in the world today is what's happening with Bitcoin, right? And you're seeing the price go up because a bunch of institutional investors on Wall Street are all getting into it. Now it's gone from retail to institutional. And the narrative, basically, it's a really profound narrative, which is it's the separation of money and state. So if you think about like one of the most important events in human history was the separation of church and state, where we no longer look to the state to determine, what religion everyone was going to be. Well, what crypto is introducing is this idea that the government cannot control the money supply. I think that's what he's talking about with the decentralization, is that you could have a currency that everybody in the world believes in that no government can control. That's the separation of money and state. Now, this is just really a narrative right now. And who knows if it will actually come true. But the interesting thing is that if everybody does believe in it, it will come true. And so Bitcoin's been sort of described as the bubble that never ends, because if everyone kind of buys into this bubble, it actually comes true. So I think it's very interesting. And you're seeing, because Bitcoin is kind of perceived as the antidote to inflation and money printing by the government, I think you're seeing it take on new urgency now because the government just keeps printing trillions and trillions of dollars of new money.
Doesn't this threaten government? So if government doesn't have control over monitoring financial transactions and have control over the accounts in which the financial assets sit, which is effectively the notion of decentralized anonymized wallets, then how does the government secure taxation, which is requisite for their ability to fund to fund the state, right? And so what happens to the state?
Well, so there's an enormous amount of leakage that happens today in assets that actually get financialized, but in the gray market. And I think the beautiful thing is, on the one hand, we become less focused on like the M1 and the M2 money supply, like the physical, printable, distributable money that we can see and touch. And it gets replaced with virtual currencies that are tied to other things. I think what the person who wrote the question is asking really is more about DeFi and what's happening sort of like on the Ethereum, 2.0 ERC20 contracts, all that stuff, which is sort of much more next gen, I think, than Bitcoin. And I think at some point we should deep dive into it. But what I would say, Friedberg, is all the leakage you have today goes away in a world of DeFi because you will financialize every single asset possible. You'll financialize your homes, you'll financialize your cars, your watches, your jewelry, your art. You'll financialize every random thing.
Maybe even your career.
And how people will trade it. Absolutely, your career. And the thing is, by monetizing it and financializing it, you can borrow against it, you can trade it, you can pull forward value into the future against it, but it'll all be tracked. And so as long as a government then says, listen, we're going to enable it all, but there needs to be an off-ramp to taxation. And that's pretty simple because a physical house exists in the world. You can't hide the existence of a physical house.
But it's not anonymized, right, Chamath? And so, if you want to track it, I mean, that's the challenge. I'm saying if it is anonymized, then the government can't track it, and the government can't.
But I think these are two separate things. Some assets will live anonymously, and those are the assets that don't need to exist in the real world. But I think what this will create is a world where all of these assets that actually truly exist in the real world, it'll be fine that it exists and that people get taxed on it, but it'll be much more legitimate. And I think it'll be simpler. And so I think people will trade off incremental taxation for incremental monetizability. I'll give you an example. Let's use real estate. There is no reason why every single piece of land everywhere around the world isn't written into a ledger with knowledge of who owns it, such that the person that owns it could trade it, could borrow against it, could sell it,
could fractionalize it.
Fractionalize it.
Even if you can't fractionalize in the real world because your neighbors won't let you set it up into 4 lots, you could do that online.
And so today, what will happen is that, that person has a level of wealth, and what they do instead, take the United States, is they lobby to create all this convoluted real estate tax law to make their life simpler. But if you actually unlocked the ability to focus on revenue versus expenses, you just wouldn't focus as much on the taxation because you'd say, well, I can make so much more money.
If you judge, just to sort of answer the question here from the listener. I think you can really judge this based upon how much it's being pumped by the people who own it. And they are absolutely dogged, religious about this. It's like talking to a person who's, met Jesus and now everybody has to be a Christian. And you can also look at the people who are opposing it. I don't know if you saw Yellen and then Christine Lagarde. She came out against it. Yellen's come out against it. India might ban it. And then you have, obviously, China's coming out with their digital yuan. So I think there's going to be a dogfight here where governments are not going to easily give up their control of this. And there's many ways they can make a bunch of red tape to slow this down. And in countries that are authoritarian, they can outright ban it. Let's take another question here.
By the way, there's like 3 outcomes here, right? I mean, you could either see Bitcoin, for example, being banned, and that's going to be ugly. And obviously there would be significant financial loss at this point. I mean, to Sachs's point, at some point, there's so much asset value tied up in Bitcoin, it's too big to fail.
Sorry, David, banned by who?
Oh, that's
Chinese government.
This is what they're trying to do in some of the states, right? And they're trying to make it illegal for citizens to transfer money in and out of the asset class.
I think it's a bigger threat to countries that want to impose export or currency controls and export restrictions. Yeah. But frankly, if you're a country that's not afraid of currency movements because you're not trying to do something oppressive to your people, I don't think you have that much to fear here. I mean, there are other ways of trying to hide assets or hide money besides Bitcoin. And every Bitcoin transaction is written into the ledger. I think you have to be pretty dumb to try and commit a crime with Bitcoin because there's going to be a permanent record in the blockchain forever of that transfer. And then there's companies that provide that do kind of sleuthing and try to unravel.
So, you think tax evasion in the United States is going to be difficult with Bitcoin? If I accrue a bunch of value in Bitcoin, am I going to be able to evade paying taxes on those gains and convert that Bitcoin into physical assets by purchasing it from another Bitcoin wallet holder?
I mean,
how realistic is tax evasion going to be? And how much because that's ultimately what the U.S. government would mostly do.
Well, so you would convert cash into Bitcoin, and then you want to sell your Bitcoin at some point. You're going to have to sell it. I mean, there would be a realization event.
Or no, I'm saying transfer it to a seller of another asset that's willing to accept Bitcoin in receipt. And so 2 anonymized wallets.
I don't know. I mean, that transaction is going to live on the blockchain forever, and it's going to live in the books of whoever the seller is. What are they selling you? A car, a house, whatever? I mean, a watch. I mean, look, if it's a personal item, maybe, but if we're talking about a substantial asset, like a house or a company or something, they're going to need to, the other side of the transaction is going to need to report the realization event. So you're going to have 2 people collude to engage in tax evasion.
It's like?
Seems like a really stupid thing to do.
Legally incorporated businesses are going to be mandated to do effectively identity verification, much like we have to do under the Patriot Act with all the financial law.
Totally.
Know your buyer.
Yeah.
That's ultimately how the compromise arises, right?
Yeah. I'm not that worried about, I feel like this whole like Silk Road type Bitcoin will be used illegally thing is like kind of a old meme about it that I think that the fears are like greatly exaggerated. But the thing that jumps out at me about all the critics of Bitcoin, and I'm not like a pumper or whatever, but I do own some, is the thing that like all these like critics don't seem to understand is the technology. That's the common denominator, whether it's like Howard Marks or Warren Buffett or Charlie Munger, whoever, they're all like great investors or whatever, but they're not technologists.
It's a blind spot.
It's a blind spot. And the thing they don't understand about the technology is that Bitcoin is the first digital asset to ever be created that you can't create infinite copies of, right? So think about like a song or a photo or a video or whatever, anything that's digital. You've always been able to make an infinite number of copies. Isn't that what the word digital means? Is that it's infinitely copyable. So how do you have digital money that can't just be infinitely copied? Obviously, that would destroy the value. And that was the genius of Bitcoin, is that every transaction is written into this ledger. The blockchain is decentralized. And nobody over the last decade or so has figured out how to counterfeit Bitcoin, how to make a duplicate, how to double spend Bitcoin. As long as that remains true, then Bitcoin can serve as money if everyone believes in it. The day that someone figures out how to counterfeit a Bitcoin, how to double spend it, it's all worthless.